So we're putting tariffs. We have 25% tariffs on $250 billion, and they're paying it. And believe me, so many people say our people pay a little bit, but it's worth it. It's really worth it.
All right, so in spite of the remarks that you just heard there from the president, new information from Morgan Stanley alleges that proposed 25% tariffs on more than $300 billion of Chinese imports could in fact trigger a global recession. And according to critics of the plan, the tariffs will not do much to make trade with China more fair for the U.S.
So in an op-ed published at the Economic Policy Institute, senior economist Robert Scott says that while the president can impose draconian tariffs on imports from China, it still won't solve the most fundamental trade problem for America: chronic trade deficits. Robert Scott joins us now. He also serves as the Director of Trade and Manufacturing Policy Research at EPI. Mr. Scott, welcome.
Glad to have you.
Thanks for having me.
Robert, what I find so fascinating about your work, and why I'm so glad you could come on, is you agree that trade deficits are actually a problem. If you were to talk to many of the mainstream economists or many of the people that you would see on other networks, they would say, oh, the trade relationship with China is completely fine, and the tariffs are a unilateral tax on American consumers, something I didn't know despite my own background in economics. And so tell us what is wrong specifically with President Trump's tariff policy if you actually do care about the trade deficit with China.
If you really care about the trade deficit with China, what you want to do is come up with a strategy, a plan that's going to reduce the deficit, not just with China, but with all of the countries that have been running large, systematic surpluses with the world for the past 2 decades. And that includes Japan, Korea, and the European Union, which now actually has the largest surplus in the world. The single best tool we have for reducing our deficit, their surplus, is to lower the value of the U.S. dollar. The dollar is too strong. It acts like a subsidy to all of the exports from China and these other countries, and a tax on everything we're trying to sell to China, Japan, and the entire world. We compete with these countries. So the dollar is really the key variable. The problem with the tariff is China has used it as an excuse to actually lower the value of its currency by about 8%. That's China's ace in the hole. So it has allowed them to essentially escape the tariffs. They lower the cost of their products, and so when we oppose a tariff, the net effect is really a
like
push.
A 17%.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay,
All right, so just to go back to the basics, why, in your view, are trade deficits bad?
Trade deficits are bad, thank you, because they displace domestic workers. So rising imports push people out of jobs.
Yeah.
We see that American firms have closed, in the past 20 years, they've closed roughly 90,000 factories.
Right.
And my research shows that growing trade deficits with China have cost us roughly 3.5 million jobs. We've probably lost another 1 million jobs to Japan, maybe 700,000 even to Mexico. So all of these countries that we're running deficits with are costing us jobs. That's the most obvious tip of the iceberg.
Yeah.
The other thing that's going on is that competition with low-wage workers in countries like China is driving down wages, and not just for people in manufacturing, where they compete directly, but essentially everybody who looks like a manufacturing worker. And that means anybody who doesn't have a college degree. And that makes up about 70% of the labor force. 100 million people seeing their wages pushed down because of competition with low-wage labor in China and Mexico and countries like that.
How much of the manufacturing job loss and the wage reduction effect that you're talking about here too, how much of that is trade deficit and how much of that is automation?
I would put virtually all of the blame on the trade deficit. Economists may differ. We've lost a total of about 5 million manufacturing jobs. I've said with trade with China alone, we're looking at about half of that, about 2.5 million manufacturing jobs. And that number is something that's the economists agree on.
Yeah.
A number of leading studies have now shown we've lost 1.5 to 2.5 million jobs just to trade with China. And then we add in all these other countries I talked about, Europe and Japan. So it's really a global problem. So I think trade is, by and large, the single most important cause of job loss. Technology is something we've had for hundreds of years, and yet it hasn't eroded our manufacturing sector. All the big job losses have come in the last 20 years as we've globalized.
Right. Robert, I'm not surprised to see Wall Street warning that tariffs could lead to a recession, and they're very pro a strong dollar. What we hear from many of them is that oh, these jobs are gone. They're never coming back.
Sure.
There's nothing we can do, so everybody needs to learn to code and we'll become a nation of software engineers. Is that true? Are jobs actually just gone forever, disappeared into the ether, or can a viable and robust manufacturing force return to America in a 21st century economy?
I think it's a myth, the claim that these jobs can't be recovered. In fact, if we shrink those trade deficits, which we talked about, which last year reached $891 billion in total goods trade deficit, if we eliminate that, we could create probably between 2 and 3 million manufacturing jobs. And the thing about manufacturing is that those jobs not only pay well, they have great benefits, pensions and health care. So they're kind of a leading edge for wages, again, for workers that don't have a college degree. We could do even more to support manufacturing by investing in rebuilding our infrastructure and starting the transition to a green economy. All of those things will create demand for new products that can put more people to work in good jobs in manufacturing. The other thing about manufacturing is that for every person who works in a plant, there's probably another 1 to 2 people who work in good jobs in sectors like engineering and management and law and accounting. These are all sectors that are supported by the output of the manufacturing industries. And those are very good jobs as well.
What about, some people point out that, manufacturing jobs were not always good jobs, right? They used to be very dangerous. I mean, they're still dangerous, but unions really help make sure that people were protected, that they were middle income jobs, that you had that pension, that you had that health care. Why not go through that same struggle and make the service sector jobs that are the largest growing jobs in the country right now also good paying, middle class, life sustaining types of work?
Well, there are some service jobs that are great, like I said, like you say, computer programming, accounting, law. Those take advanced degrees.
Right. Well, the ones I'm talking about are working at Walmart.
Yeah,
right?
working
I mean,
at Walmart.
Those are in every community, basically in the country. If you go there, most of the jobs have been sucked down, and what is left is like Walmart, Wendy's, McDonald's. Those are the jobs that are growing right now. So can't we make those good jobs?
We should make those good jobs. And one of the most, I think, simple and effective ways to do that is to raise the minimum wage. We have a campaign now to raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour. We'll have a huge impact on all of those people in those jobs. But the core problem is that kind of work is just not very productive. So if we, and the jobs that are available in manufacturing are very productive. They produce a lot of output per worker, and companies can afford to pay their workers more, $25, $30 an hour or more. So it's just innately more productive. So, and if we do that, if we shift workers out of those low-wage industries like home health care or retail trade, then we can create more good jobs, and we'll force those companies in services to automate and to make those jobs more productive. So it all goes together hand in glove, I think.
So, Robert, how would you evaluate President Trump as a pro-worker president? He was swept into the Oval Office on the backs of workers of the Midwest. Has he delivered the promises to them that he promised, or is he not done very well, but just best relative to the rest of the field?
Frankly, I think to this point, it's been mostly smoke and mirrors. It's quite apparent that this president loves to generate press releases, but he doesn't really care about the outcomes. He's had numerous press conferences. He started even before he took office. He announced that there was a factory in Indianapolis that was going to close, Carrier, and Carrier's going to close and move to Mexico. I'm going to step in. I'm going to negotiate a deal. He got that company hundreds of billions of dollars of benefits. He and his vice president, Mike Pence, cooperated jointly in doing that, and yet Carrier moved those jobs to Mexico anyway. Likewise, he cut a deal with Foxconn, billions of dollars in state subsidies to Foxconn to build a factory in Wisconsin. No factory is never going to happen. He wants a deal with the Chinese. He wants a piece of paper he can announce. He can have a press conference. He can have a handshake with Chinese President Xi. This is what he seems to be working on. But he promised as a candidate that that on his first day in office, his first act was going to be to declare that China was a currency manipulator, that it was undervaluing its currency. Exactly what we've been talking about here. So he understands, I think, what the problem is. He was unwilling to actually take the steps needed to do it.
Why do you think that is?
I think it's because He cares much more about the interest of Wall Street than he does about workers and Main Street companies who are producing goods here in the United States. As you said earlier, Wall Street loves a strong dollar. It keeps those cheap imports available through outsourcing. It makes it easy to threaten workers that you're going to move plants, keep their wages down. It keeps up the demand for stock high. Stock prices stay high, profits going to traders stay up. But that's not really in the interest of the economy. We need a competitive dollar, one that's going to allow us to rebalance trade and create a strong economy. There's really, I think, a sharp distinction between what's good for Wall Street and what's good for the rest of us. And it's clear that I think in his policy actions, Trump has acted first and foremost to protect the interest of the wealthy. We saw that with a tax cut. Most of the benefits of the tax cuts went to multinational companies and the very wealthy.
Even though that's not what he promised on the campaign trail.
Even though it's not what he promised.
So let me ask you on another Trump issue, what do you make of the newly renegotiated NAFTA deal? I can never remember what it's called.
USMCA.
Yeah. It doesn't exactly roll off the tongue.
Right.
But what do you make of the contours of that deal?
I think it's not going to make much difference, frankly.
Yeah.
There's some good clauses in there, for example, about encouraging firms to hire more workers in the U.S. and Canada. So maybe that will help, maybe it won't. But in fact, just this week, Ford has announced they're laying off another 7,000 workers. A couple of months ago, GM announced it was closing, I think, 5 or 6 plants in the U.S. and Canada. So despite all of those clauses that seem to create incentives to produce in the U.S. and Canada, companies are going ahead and continuing to make plans to offshore production to lower wage locations. So I just don't think it's going to work.
Which Democrat in the field, or you could name a few, but who do you think kind of understands these issues and has so far put forward the plans that'll be most effective in the Democratic field?
Well, I think certainly I've worked closely with progressive Democrats like Bernie Sanders. He's campaigned before. He's very familiar with the kinds of proposals we're putting forth to get tough on currency. I think I can do it. But I think there are many candidates. Elizabeth Warren, I think, is willing to take on Wall Street. Tim Ryan has been working on trade issues for many years. So I think there are a number that could do this. But I think I'd look to somebody who's got a base in manufacturing regions in the Midwest. Warren's in Massachusetts, they have a lot of manufacturing there. So I think those are the candidates most likely to have good platforms.
You didn't mention Joe Biden. It's the front runner.
That's interesting. I did not know, but obviously he's going to be something we're going to look for. So far, he hasn't been very strong on trade. His first comment was, "Well, China's not a problem." Well, China, in fact, is a huge problem, and we need to address that.
All right, Mr. Scott, thank you. Great to have you.
Thank you, sir.
Thanks for having me.
Coming up, in the aftermath of the 2016 election, President Obama wondered whether he was, quote, 10 or 20 years too early.
That's just one of his insights from the New York Times chief White House correspondent Peter Baker's update to his book on President Obama's tenure. Our conversation when Rising continues.